So one thing I've learned is that cold side oxidation exposure after your beer is done fermenting is really detrimental, especially to hoppy beers. So today I'm going to demonstrate a closed keg transfer using a fairly simple process that should be able to work for any type of keg and any type of fermenter, especially if it has a spigot. So let's get brewing. So I've got a beer in the fermentation chamber that's ready to be kegged. Let's go ahead and walk through quickly what that's going to look like. So to simulate that, I've got this small fermenter, and then this would be a tube for a blow-off tube. In this particular case, I'm just using some 3/8 tubing. I also have another keg set up where I have some 1/4" tubing, but the 3/8 tubing is probably a little bit more flexible for different situations. So essentially, it's just 3/8 tubing, in this case, stuck into the top of the fermenter using a small piece of a formal racking cane. This fermenter has a spigot, which is pretty important. If you don't have a spigot, you may have to look at a little different process for doing this. So the other pieces of equipment I have are both a gas and a liquid quick disconnect. In this case, I'm using ball lock. If you're using pin lock, the same type of thing should apply. I've got a barb that I've used to connect the tube. This is one I had to get, a 3/8" tubing one. If you don't have a 3/8" tubing one, what you can do, I've found with these threaded, is they go right on. The only downside really is the threads really kind of dig into the tubing, so you have to cut it off and replace it fairly often, at least cut off the end, because you don't want the inside of the tubing to be all scratched up. The other piece I have is this inline filter. There's a brand called Bouncer. This was an off brand that was a little bit cheaper. I think it's optional, but it helps a lot, especially with hoppy beers. The ones we're doing today are not hoppy, but if there gets a little bit of crud in there, it'll help keep it from getting into the keg. And then the other piece I have are 2 pieces of tubing. So looking at my keg, out, remember, is for beer. I threw a couple label on here because maybe it's a little confusing because we're actually transferring beer in this tubing. This has got the tube that goes to the bottom. So we're going to transfer the beer from the fermenter through that tubing down into the bottom of the keg. So to do that, we're going to take black, I'm going to take the barb and we're going to put that on there like that. I've got a small piece of tubing. It's going to go on there, and that's going to connect to the filter. And this filter has a very small little arrow on it, but I drew some arrows to make it a little bit more obvious. And in this case, the beer's going in, the out. So we're going to poke that like that. And now we've got another longer tube. It's going to go on there. These aren't sanitized yet. So this piece needs to be long enough to go from the beer connection to our fermenter, which is likely going to be up, it's going to be up above it. So it's going to look like that. The beer is going to flow out the spigot and in to the outpost. If we look at the other connection on the keg, so remember this is our blow-off tube, which is currently connected to the fermenter that's in the chamber. We're going to just take that. In this case, I don't have an extra barb. I'm just going to place it on there, and that's going to be good enough for this one. I'm not too worried about the gas line getting scraped up a little bit, and that should hold that quite well. And I'm going to just click that onto there. So let me see if I can get an accurate representation of what we got here. So essentially we've got the spigot coming out of the fermenter, and the fermenter will be elevated up above. Beer will flow through the spigot, through the filter, into the outpost of the keg. It'll go down, fill from the bottom of the keg up. So at the same time, it'll be pushing the CO2 that's in the keg out through the gas post. And that gas post will then connect to the top of the fermenter, and then that'll fill the head space. In this case, we're not introducing any oxygen at all as we do the transfer. So the next steps I have to do is to go ahead and fully purge and sanitize the keg, and then we'll go ahead and do our transfer. My first rule of brewing is that you can never have enough buckets. Starting with a clean keg, the first step is to fill the keg with a sanitizing solution. I'm using some pre-mixed Star San solution. There are other similar sanitizers like SaniClean that don't foam. They might be easier to use for this purpose, but I have not tried them. I'm just using this funnel that I've had for many years, and I'll ensure that I fill the keg to the rim with solution. With the keg filled to the brim as much as possible, it's time to seal up the keg. I'll depress the poppets to release air that might still be in the dip tube, and then I put the keg lid in place. I suspect there are some very small pockets of air still left in the keg, but not enough for me to worry about. I have a 15-pound and a 5-pound CO2 tank. I normally use this 5-pound tank for tasks like purging. I have a couple pairs of gas quick disconnects that I got off more beer. They're pretty handy for connecting different ends to the tank. I set the pressure down to about 5 psi. You just need enough to push out the solution, so higher pressure would just waste more CO2. Yeah, my high pressure gauge in this regulator has seen better days. I've thought about replacing it, but I don't really see the need. With the CO2 connected to the gas post, the sanitizing solution will be pushed out of the liquid dip tube. Note, while I'm showing purging my 10-liter torpedo keg, I use the same process and equipment for my 5-gallon ball lock kegs. I don't use pin lock kegs, but I'm pretty sure the same process would apply there as well. One difference with these torpedo kegs is that the dip tube runs straight down one side of the keg, where my other kegs have a dip tube that bends to the center of the keg. So as most of the solution is pushed out, I tilt the keg to get as much of the solution as possible. I want to leave some pressure in the keg, as I'll use the pressure in the keg to purge the transfer tubing and filter. I'll show that part in a second. At this point, I have a keg that's fully purged with CO2. The keg, transfer line, and filter have all been sanitized. Before the transfer, I sanitized the fermenter spigots as well. As I hopefully demonstrated earlier, to support the transfer process, I use a blow-off tube throughout fermentation. At this point, the line should be full of CO2 produced during the fermentation. I attach the gas disconnect to the end to seal it up. Any small amount of air that gets in this line will just get pushed in the headspace of the fermenter. I might pick up another 3/8 inch barb, but the line fits snugly over the threads of the disconnect. At this point, I've drained the solution out of the transfer tube and filter, but they are now full of air. So I first connect the line to the spigot, and then connect the disconnect to the keg. The CO2 in the keg will then purge out the line in the filter and exit out the small hole in the front of the spigot. I suspect there's still a small amount of air still in the line or the filter, but this process has worked well for oxygen-sensitive styles like New England IPAs. After connecting the gas line, I just need to open up the spigot to get the flow going. After that, gravity does most of the work. Transferring through the ball lock connect slows the process down over just a straight tube transfer, but it usually only takes 10 minutes or so, even to transfer a full 5-gallon batch. When I get toward the end of the transfer, I usually tilt the fermenter to get that last little bit of precious beer. I try to stop the transfer before getting yeast or sediment into the keg. On this day, I was kegging a 5-gallon batch that had split into 2 fermenters and fermented each with a different yeast. I cleaned out the transfer line, then followed the same steps to purge the keg and to transfer this second batch. The process that I use should work well for any fermenter with a spigot, and many of the same concepts should apply to other type of fermenters as well. As I wait for these kegs of beer to carbonate, be sure to check out my playlist of other how-to videos. Or check out some of my content on building great beers. Also, go ahead and click that like button and subscribe to get notified of future content.